Hey, party people, and welcome once again to Law and Candor. This is episode 3 of season 4 of the podcast, wholly devoted to pursuing the legal technology revolution. As you know, I am Bill. I am here with my partner in crime, Rob, and we have a great episode today. It's around Legal Operations 101, and for this, we actually interviewed Debora Motyka Jones, whose experience is vast. Let's just put it that way. We'll get into a little bit with her. So her take on legal operations is interesting because she's seen it from so many angles. But before we get to that fabulous interview, we want to start with the portion of the program. It's our favorite, what we call
Sightings of Radical Brilliance.
This is a portion of the program where we actually bring to you the hot new stories that are in the market that are affecting the legal technology revolution. Rob, what do we got today?
You know, today thought it made sense to talk about biometric data and some of the legal issues that are surrounding that, just because we're seeing this more and more. And just as maybe like a refresher, biometric data, this is basically things that analyze unique physical and behavioral characteristics of people. I can tell you that my wife has been using biometric data for a long time to control me in many ways, but apparently, people are concerned about, how biometric data is collected, who owns it, how can it be used again? And I think as this technology proliferates, it's definitely worthy of talking about.
I think this is a subset of the paranoia around the release of 5G too, right? That network that's going to be all around and better than Wi-Fi, and the ability to actually scan your retinas as you're walking through a mall and then lead you to a place that might have the sneakers you were looking for. I mean, there are ways that businesses are going to capitalize this. Look, it's getting scary. That's certainly one way to look at it, but there's no way to stop it. If there is a way for companies to leverage information, they are going to do it. Whether it's through advertising dollars or something else, some other way to coax you in, they're going to use it. And so this information is obviously readily available for anybody who's out in public. I mean, they can do a retina scan, fingerprint scan. There are things that are currently happening right now where biometrics are being used in business. How they're going to be deployed, I think we saw this with Google Glass. I know that product never really took off, but with Google Glass, there was that whole ability when you're walking down the street, in the periphery of the glass, it will actually tell you about sales that are going on in stores as you're walking by them. And I think people started to get a little freaked out by that whole thing. Well, forget that. You could just take the glasses off. You don't have to deal with it. What are you going to do when they start to ping your phone because you walked by? They recognized you by a retina scan from 100 yards away, and they're advertising that there's 2-for-1 chicken McNuggets at the local McDonald's as you're walking by trying to fight your craving.
Well, and I think it goes even further, like it's getting collected more and more. Like, when I log onto my computer now, I use a fingerprint. If I decide to trace my ancestry and, I do a DNA test, suddenly, maybe that data is accessible to law enforcement. We've talked about that in prior seasons. There was one case that we were just reading about before the podcast about, a tanning salon that was collecting, fingerprint biometric data. It goes into bankruptcy, and now you have, customers that are upset, first of all, that it was, being collected and saved. And then, in the case of a bankruptcy, who's going to own that data now? And Bill, as you know, I would not want anyone knowing that I spent, 200 visits at a tanning salon in any given year. That would be tough.
Well, you should get if you did, you should get a refund, because I've never seen you tan in my life, my friend. Look, I think, again, this is one of those things. It's an evolution in technology. Is it leading to progress? I'm not sure. Is there going to be a way to stop it? Absolutely not. And so what's going to end up coming of this is you can see the political fight already. I'm not sure which side would have it, because I frankly can't tell the difference between them on an issue like this anymore. This would be a libertarian issue. It would also be a psycho-liberal issue, a psycho-right-wing issue, psycho-left-wing issue. I'm not quite sure where the right and left will land on this, but I am absolutely positive that someone will take ownership of it and make it a wedge issue. And so regulations will be hard to come by, at least regulations with any teeth, because there's not going to be any consensus around how to handle it. Some people are going to say, hey, this is the wave of the future. This is the way businesses have to operate. And some people are going to want to protect privacy rights, and they're not going to be able to find a balance between the two. So you could see a prolonged political battle over this.
Well, and to make it worse, these movies like Minority Report and other things,
yeah,
those scare us even more. So I agree with you.
Yeah, I always love at committee meetings in Congress when somebody will bring up like a movie from the '80s to warn us about what could be coming down the pipe in the future, because that's their frame of reference to these things. Look, I think it's going to be it's something that businesses are going to do. It's something governments are going to have to try to regulate. I'd love to see it be done in a bipartisan fashion to have all sides considered. I just think it's going to take a long time to get that done. But it's scary and also incredibly intriguing.
Agree. Well, let's move on. We are excited to hear, as Bill mentioned before, from our former boss and great speaker, Debora. Great, Debora. Why don't we kick things off by just having you give an introduction of yourself?
Sure. I started my legal career as a litigator at Weil, Gotshal and Manges in DC. And after several years as a lawyer, I decided to go the business route. And I joined Lighthouse about 10 and a half years ago and have done a number of different things on the business side. I've run marketing and product marketing, sales, our geographic expansion in the US, as well as been an executive in charge of numerous functions, including most recently our service delivery organization. So technicians all the way through to client managers working directly with clients across the 50 states. About 6 months ago, for personal reasons, I decided to step away from that and have spent the last 6 months focusing on legal operations. Given my background with business and legal, it made sense to marry those two passions and spend the last 6 months investigating the legal operations market and interviewing legal operations professionals, getting an understanding of the trends and what people are focused on at Fortune 500 companies.
It's a broad spectrum of stuff. Is it fair to say that the highlight was working with Rob and I?
Yeah, I miss it every day.
Yeah, I kept waiting.
So let's we start in these podcasts. We like to start from the 10,000 foot. It's great doing it like this because as everybody who's on this podcast knows, I'm the idiot of the group. So we start really broad and then we start to dive in. And when I get lost, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Rob can pick it up in terms of understanding stuff. But let's start at the 10,000 foot overview. Let's set the stage. What exactly is quote unquote legal ops?
Yeah, great question. At a high level, it's that marriage of business and legal. So the business of running a legal department. Many people look at it as the chief of staff in a legal department or a chief of staff function, looking at efficiencies in the department, financial metrics, managing technology, etc. But really bringing that legal understanding with business processes together into running a legal department.
Yeah, it kind of feels like, legal ops has been around for a while, but it's finally kind of getting the respect, that it deserves these days. What are some of the key trends that you're seeing in the legal ops field?
I would say that there's two. The first is around contract management. So, to your point, legal operations is relatively new as something that's a hot area of discussion, and I think it really started with e-billing technology 5, maybe even 10 years ago, depending on the organization. And most organizations have settled on their e-billing technology and processes and are now moving to contract management and implementation of processes and software. Some organizations have processes and software in place, but they're modernizing those because the technology has really come a long way there. And others are starting from scratch, focusing on putting in place a new process and technology to support that process. Since contracts are the bread and butter of a lot of legal departments, it makes sense as an area to focus on. The second trend I'm seeing is in artificial intelligence. And I would say that this trend is a little newer in that people are really thinking about it and exploring rather than implementing. And in this area, it ranges. It ranges from artificial intelligence on top of e-billing and contract management solutions to better understand that space, to predict work. In other words, how many people are needed to review contracts and the workflows in the legal department, all the way through to dashboards looking at how to be more effective in legal, dashboards predicting metrics, dashboards looking at what kinds of documents, contracts, et cetera, can be reviewed just by artificial intelligence and not human resources. And so really that's an exploratory phase there, but artificial intelligence is definitely top of mind for people.
So let's talk about the core competencies of the departments affected. So I mean, because I think that's always something that when you start talking about technology assisting whatever kind of department we're talking about, what are the core competencies of the departments?
I would say it varies from company to company, and the most common trend is just general efficiency. And so, what does that mean? I mean, it means very different things depending on where your legal department is. I speak to people who have legal departments of several thousand lawyers and people who have legal departments of 20 lawyers, depending on the core business. And as you can imagine, the competencies vary. But really, it is about business intelligence. It is about technology roadmaps. It is about filling that ambassador role to finance, to procurement, to IT, and really liaising with those departments to bring business processes to the legal department. Clock actually has quite a good list of 12 competencies that legal operations departments focus on. ACC also has a list of competencies, and you'll see those themes repeated throughout those competencies.
Given that the field is growing and kind of getting more of that respect, clearly I think it's going to attract a lot more people to it. We used to joke in lit support that like the main requirement was like a degree in 18th century, English poetry. But for people that want to get into legal ops, what are the skills and the background that people are looking for?
Yeah, either that or drama. I mean, drama's another good one, right? I put these in two buckets. I would say, looking more at soft skills first, problem solving and trust building. So those are my two buckets. And what I mean by problem solving is just curiosity, talking to people, figuring out what are the pain points in legal, because that translates into what the efficiencies could be for legal. Then an analytical mind to figure out and dig a little deeper on diagnosing the pain point and the potential solution. And then a drive for results, right? How to solve that pain point and get results there. And then on the trust building side, I mentioned the liaison to other departments. In many organizations, legal has this reputation of being frivolous with spending, right? People don't understand why the litigation is 3x what you told finance it would be. And managing risk and putting a price on that is very difficult often for the business. And so there tends to be trust issues between the legal department and other teams that they're liaising with. And so being able to build that trust through empathy, understanding, and follow through are key soft skills. On the actual experience side, any of those core competencies, experience in implementing technology, experience in business processes, in managing vendors, in financial analysis, those are some great kind of hard skills that through your career, if you have or if you develop in order to get into this field, are very valuable.
So I love this question. We reserve it for people who had a broad sort of array of experiences across in our industry, and I think it's always helpful whenever I go back and listen to the podcast myself, or whenever I talk to somebody about it, when we have a guest that could talk about lessons learned throughout their career, specifically on the topic that we're talking about. Can you get into some of the lessons that you learned as you started to tackle some of this stuff?
Well, my biggest management lessons have come from the two of you. But
that would test anyone.
Yeah. I'm guessing you probably want something related to legal operations. I would say, if I think back, it's really about underestimating the change management cycle. As a legal operations professional, one of the things you're doing is bringing efficiency to the legal department. What does that mean? That means you are asking people to do something differently. And people don't like change. Change is another thing on top of their day job. And so I remember when I was doing some product management a decade ago, and I was very frustrated with why we weren't making certain deadlines. And I dealt with it in a way that I like to think I've grown since then and wouldn't do again, which was with a lot of frustration. And instead, once I sat back and reflected, What I should have done is realized the buy-in that I needed to get along the way and much earlier on in order to allow that change to take place in people's minds throughout the project, as opposed to when you're trying to reach that finish line and that date is very close. And so I think that learning applies a lot to legal operations where you are bringing on new technology, you are bringing on new processes, you are working with lawyers who tend to be risk averse and averse to change. And so getting that buy-in early, getting some champions early, making sure those champions have plenty of time to sit with what the change will be and be advocates is critical and something that I stumbled through early on.
Yeah, thank you for not using Bill or my name in that frustrating incident that you were.
Well, she knows I'm actually opposed to any sort of personal growth, as my wife can attest.
Well, as we kind of continue, in this exploration, when you think about best practices and, key lessons that you've learned, what do you think you could share with us about that?
I would say that, whether you're new in a legal operations role or need to make a change in the way you're doing things, the two areas that I would recommend and that I've heard echoed from others that I've spoken to is building in regular check-ins and getting to metrics early. And so let me explain both of those. The building in regular check-ins, I mentioned earlier the problem solving and the curiosity and the figuring out ways to get more efficient within the legal department and building that trust with other departments. That takes conversations with people to understand their world. And so I think setting up those check-ins with the GC, with somebody in finance, whether it be a peer or somebody that your GC speaks to or attending a meeting already ongoing, and then key attorneys within the department so that you're just regularly getting different perspectives and really understanding people's worlds. And then similarly, that also allows you to get that buy-in early on with any change management you're doing during that two-way conversation. The second is building out a metrics dashboard. If you're trying to get efficient, one of the best things you can do is show that efficiency. And that's very hard to do without baseline metrics. So oftentimes people don't start to define those metrics until a particular project. And I would argue that it's better to get some metrics, even if it's just 2 or 3 key metrics that you identify early, and start baselining those from the beginning. You can always add or change, but at least if you have those, you have a foundation to build off of, and they also get you some additional information to potentially drive efficiency. And then separately, a third tip that I've heard a lot is have a plan B. Legal is a cost center. Legal budgets get cut constantly. Even if legal has a ton of support in your organization, that pesky little litigation that you thought you would settle that has all of a sudden blown up steals your budget for your contract management tool. And you have to have a plan B because otherwise, as legal operations, you'll get stuck and you won't be able to move a lot of projects along. And so whether it is scaling things down to do a little pilot or scaling things down to roll out, for example, with the contract management tool only for NDAs or only for your service agreements, or some sort of scaled down plan B for any implementation will allow you to still get quick wins and prove that value, even though you may not be as resourced as you initially contemplated when launching the project.
So that's really interesting, and I think you touched on a couple things throughout in terms of resources that people could go to when they're interested. I know you said Clock has a list of core competencies, things like that. A lot of times when people are listening to the podcast, they'll click, we release them all so people can binge watch it, like like Tiger King, which I think Rob would be the Tiger King for the purposes of this podcast. So if they're gonna look at the titles and they're going to choose to click on this one and listen to this one, and it means they have an interest in this topic. Where can they go to get additional resources if they're entering the space and they're really interested?
Absolutely. In terms of organizations out there, the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, CLOC, which I mentioned earlier, has a lot of really great resources. They've grown to 2,200 members, so a lot of peer-to-peer resources if you join that organization, a lot of templates, great blog posts. The core competencies I mentioned earlier can be found on their website. The ACC also has a section dedicated to legal operations, again, newer in the last several several years, a lot of great peer-to-peer. So that's another great place to go, templates, etc. If you want additional information about legal department management, that's kind of a broader umbrella topic. You can search that. There's a lot of good blogs on that topic, as well as some benchmarking surveys with metrics. And then finally, if you're looking for roles in legal operations specifically, both Clock and LinkedIn are great resources. Clock has a job board, and LinkedIn has a lot of legal operations posts listed. Finally, if you have this legal background and you're looking more on the business side, I would recommend subscribing to Harvard Business Review, as they have a lot of good business process articles, quick hits that come out quite often and can be really helpful if you're newer to the business world.
Great. Well, we've covered a lot, Debora, and we really appreciate you being here. If I could just sort of sum up a little bit. Clearly, we learned that legal operations getting a lot of increased visibility these days. Key skills for people, problem solving, building trust in an organization, having that ability to integrate technical solutions and efficiencies, helpful, other best practices, establishing metrics, regular check-ins, and of course, having a plan B. And I think the most important thing is that if you really want the ultimate test of your management skills and sanity in general, try managing Bill and Rob for a year. That's really, it doesn't get any tougher than that. But thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Debora.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And I'll be looking out for you guys on Tiger King Part 2.